Hey everybody, it's Rothbard's Disciple here. I'm bringing you guys another video. In this video, I really wanted to clear up my idea on argumentation ethics and why I think propertarians are sort of making a mistake when they just sort of make their claim as to what is property or as being just things that are defensible without trying to have an objective proof of it. Because if you use argumentation ethics, argumentation ethics, it was first introduced by a couple of socialists named Habermas and Oppel, I think. And then a guy named Hans Hermann Hoppe tried to update it for libertarianism. Both of these people failed, and actually when you look at argumentation ethics, what it actually proves is the universal ethics. It's just the ethics of property. Like a lot of people, when I talk about universal ethics, they're thinking that I'm trying to prove everything in the realm of ethics through reason. The only thing you can prove through argumentation ethics is the ethic of property, and the definition that you come to by proving the universal ethic of property through argumentation is the Propertarian definition. Okay, so this is super important, specifically because Propertarians are sort of ignoring this right now. And I personally am the type of person who prefers displays of power. I prefer strength. I don't prefer trying to make arguments to prove everything. But it's always good to have a universal proof of the basics of your philosophy. Now, the basics of Propertarianism, it's all based up around property, and again, their definition for property is that which is defensible. And we'll see here real quickly that argumentation ethics, again, it perfectly gels with Propertarianism. So I don't know why they haven't adopted this, and I think it's something that they should do. And again, this isn't like super important, like, oh, you need to go make or prove argumentation ethics to everybody. It's just something nice to have as an addition to their philosophy already. Okay, so the thing that I want to show here is, first off, I'm going to show you how argumentation breaks down without the idea of property. Okay, so the first thing you need to do to argue is you need to own your argument, which just basically means you need to make a claim. Now, making a claim alone is not enough. You, technically speaking, don't own your argument just by making a claim. So if I make the claim, I'm the coolest person in the world, that's a bad example. If I make the claim, 2 plus 2 equals 5. That's a bad argument, but it's a truth claim that I'm trying to make. But if I just make that truth claim, that's not enough, okay? Because if someone comes up to me and says, 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 5, 2 plus 2 equals 4 because of this and this and this and this, if I just repeat my claim that 2 plus 2 equals 5, we're not having an argument, okay? So in order for you to fully own your argument, the first thing that you have to do is you have to be able to defend your argument, okay? And so this is highly important because without again, this perfectly gels with the Propertarian ethic, but again, argumentation makes no sense until you defend your argument. Okay, so if you have two competing truth claims, if you're not able to defend your argument, then there's no way to take these truth claims, and there's no way to for the two people involved in this argument to come to some sort of logical conclusion. Now, this isn't saying that every argument necessarily has to end in a logical conclusion. That's not the way it works in the real world. That's why this sort of a priori axiomatic way of thinking, it only applies, or like there's only so much that you can learn from it. But again, in order to actually own the argument, first you need to stake your claim in an argument, and then you must be able to defend it. If you can't defend the argument, you can't logically be said to own that argument. Okay, the next point that I want to make here is that you alone own your argument, although you can choose a single representative for that argument. And so if I'm making the claim 2 plus 2 equals 5, and then somebody else starts arguing to me and they say, and they're making the claim 2 plus 2 equals 4, and let's just assume that I actually start to agree with them, but then somebody else comes in and says 2 plus 2 equals 5, and they agree with my initial claim. This doesn't mean that I still own the argument 2 plus 2 equals 5, and that person can't say that I still own that argument 2 plus 2 equals 5. When you're having an argument with somebody, again, the whole point is to have at least two people with conflicting truth claims. If they're going to come to some sort of agreement, it makes absolutely no sense if somebody else can come in later and sort of stake ownership in your claim and then somehow hold you I guess you would say, hold you hostage to that claim. Okay, you alone own your argument. You alone can change your argument. The one additional point I want to make to this is you can also choose a single representative for your argument. So maybe you're just not good with math, and you're trying to explain your argument, but you're not that good at it, and you find somebody else who's better at math than you, because again, we're talking about what 2 plus 2 equals, which again, that's not the most complex thing in the world, but if you're not good at defending your argument, you can choose a representative to defend your argument. So long as that representative would have to agree to sort of claiming, or they would have to agree that their argument is sort of the same argument you're making, except they're just better at defending that claim. Okay, and so the point that, or the reason why this is important for propertarian, well, we'll get into this later. The reason why this is important is it sort of underpins the idea that you can, like, you alone, or you don't have to defend your property. You can choose somebody else to defend your property. But the other point here with defending your property is if that representative starts making arguments that you don't agree with, you can always withdraw them as your representative. So when you choose a representative, it has to be completely voluntary, because again, if it's not, then argumentation doesn't make sense, because argumentation is taking different entities with competing truth claims and trying to arrive at some form of the actual truth. Okay, and so if you choose a representative and then you disagree with that representative, and you agree maybe with the person who is arguing against you, because argumentation is about taking competing truth claims and trying to come to some final version of truth, if you changed your mind, but if somehow you weren't able to withdraw your truth claim from the representative that you chose, then argumentation no longer makes sense, because you would have two people who have the same truth claim, but you would say that they're still arguing. And so that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Okay, so in order for argumentation to make sense, you alone own your argument, although you can choose a representative. The fourth point here is that violence is not a valid form of argument. This one's pretty simple. If you're able to use violence in order to prove an argument, you can prove any sort of argument, even arguments that are conflicting, because violence would be the decider. So violence by definition doesn't make sense in terms of argumentation. Okay, and so according to the property, or the argument that you own, that you have demonstrated property, or as your property, someone can't come in and use violence and then say, oh, because I beat you up, you don't still own the argument that you were arguing before. You now own the argument that I'm telling you. Okay, and so violence as a whole makes no sense in the realm of argumentation. Now, the one thing that I want to point out here that we're going to talk about later, and I have this in parentheses here, is that not all violence is illegitimate. Okay, so this is, we'll get to that, and I'm not saying that theft and murder are justified, but there are certain cases, and the certain cases specifically when someone's not capable of producing an argument. If you're not capable of producing an argument, then argumentation ethics doesn't apply, and so the protection against violence only is legitimate for those people who are capable of argumentation. And this actually has big consequences. And like I said, we'll talk about this later on. But the final point is that you must be capable of changing your argument for another. And I have in quotation marks trading here, because that's basically what you're doing. So if you have, again, if my argument starts out that 2 plus 2 equals 5, and then somebody starts arguing with me, and they say 2 plus 2 equals 4, and we both make our claims, we're both defending our claim, then I decide, hey, he's right. In order for argumentation to make sense, again, because the whole point of argumentation is to have at least two people with competing truth claims arrive at one version of truth, you have to be able to change your argument. And again, because you alone own your argument, it must be you who changes your argument. Even if you have a representative, it is still the original person who changes their argument, because like we said, when you choose a representative, you just choose someone to defend your argument for you. You're just choosing someone to do your defense for you. But it's still up to you to change your argument. Okay, and so the basics of property are all contained within these points here, that in order to own something, you have to be able to defend it. You alone own it, although you can choose somebody else to defend your argument. You still own it. You're still the one who decides whether or not it is yours, your argument, whether or not it is yours, or whether or not you agree with somebody else, but you can choose a representative. And then violence is not a valid form of argumentation. So again, going through these more point by point, and talking about how this actually relates to the real world. Again, making claims is not an argument. You must defend the claim. This perfectly gels with Propertarianism. It defines ownership as that which you can defend. And again, the other point with argumentation, it has to also be scarce. With arguments, you can't logically hold two conflicting arguments at the same time. And again, this is why when we're talking about this, you don't get too overeager with what this proves, because we're working in a very strictly defined sort of mental environment where people do not have conflicting arguments. And in the real world, people always have conflicting arguments and conflicting methods or conflicting ownership claims. So if you're trying to relate this to the real world, it gets really dirty, and so it's not that simple. But the main points here that are derived from the fact that or that ownership is defined by what you can defend is that one, if you can't defend it, you can't own it. Okay, so opinions are not defensible. If we're talking about argumentation, if I say I like ice cream, there's no way for me to actually defend that. I can just say I like ice cream or I don't. I can't say anything other than that. I can make different variations of why I like ice cream, but there's no real way for me to prove that I like ice cream. Okay, so the one thing you can derive from this is that not everything is actually possible to be owned. You have to be able to defend it in order for it to be owned. And again, because of the fact that if you're arguing, your argument by definition has to adopt these standards, otherwise argumentation makes no sense. This means that everyone who argues, they already implicitly understand these values of property. Okay, the third point here is just that this extends property beyond only physical property. That's the libertarian theory. The really weird thing about the libertarian theory is that they're trying to derive property rights from argumentation, and argumentation by definition is not physical. So the libertarian theory of argumentation ethics by definition does not work, because they're trying to derive, or they make the claim that arguments, or that you can only own physical property, but arguments aren't physical, and they're trying to derive property rights from argumentation. So if their claim is that physical or non-physical things do not have property rights or are not property, you can't derive property from something that doesn't have property. Now again, I'm not making the libertarian claim. I'm making the claim that you can own arguments because they are scarce, because again, in order to argue and make argumentation make sense, you have to choose one argument first, again, and that's where the scarcity comes from. So if we go back to where I said before with my bad argument that 2 plus 2 equals 5, I can make the argument that 2 plus 2 equals 6. I can make the argument 2 plus 2 equals 3. I can make the argument 2 plus 2 equals 4. There's an infinite number of possibilities of arguments that I can make, but I have to choose one first. So that's proving the scarcity. But the second point is that you have to be able to defend it. Okay, so the libertarian theory by definition makes no sense, because they say it's only physical, like you can only prove physical property, but you can't derive from something a property that is not inherent within it. So by definition, arguments have to contain property. Okay, and this perfectly gels with the Propertarian theory, which includes things such as intellectual property, your personal mind state, and again, your personal mind state, when conflated to everyone as a whole, is sort of the nation's ethos or morality or system of mores. And so there's a lot of things that are actually defined as property according to argumentation ethics, and again, it's everything that the Propertarians are trying to say. Now, this next point, you alone own your argument. Again, multiple owners of argumentation makes argumentation useless, because you're trying to arrive at truth claims, and if you have multiple owners of an argument, you can have two people who actually agree, but because there's multiple owners of an argument, or if you assume there could be multiple owners of an argument, the argument would still be going on between people even though they agree, which makes absolutely no sense. So you alone own your argument. Okay, so after, and again, the whole point to this is, if I state claim to my argument 2 plus 2 equals 5, another person cannot state claim to my argument and say that their argument is my argument if we're conflicting. Okay, so ownership is inherent in the person who owns it. Now you can choose another person or entity to defend your argument, but again, as soon as you are in conflict with your representative, you can withdraw this claim. Now this again goes back to like libertarians will try to say, a lot of times there can't be such thing as a ruler or a communal owner of property, you can have this communal owner of property so long as it's a voluntary agreement by the individual, and that individual just has the right to withdraw that from that agreement at any time. Okay. The other point here is that this also proves the first comer rule, which just means if you're the person, like if you stake your claim in the argument, since you were the first one there when that argument begins, it's your, or when you start arguing with somebody else, a third person can't come in and then say that they're the one involved in the argument. It's the first comer rule that matters. Now, this again, if you try to relate this to the real world, just means that people can't steal your stuff and say it's theirs. Okay, so theft of owned property is invalid. The fourth slide that I want to talk about is very important. Because this goes back to why I said not all forms of violence are unjustifiable. Okay, so violence is not a valid method of argumentation, otherwise everything is true. And again, if everything is true, there's no point to argumentation, or argumentation as a whole doesn't make sense as a concept. However, if you encounter an entity who is incapable of argumentation, property rules do not apply. Okay, so the reason why this is because in order for them, in order for you to prove that they understand this universal ethic of property, like the only way you can prove that someone understands this is if they argue. So argumentation ethics, it's not actually fully universal. It's fully universal for those who can argue. And so the reality of this truth is that conquest of low IQ cultures is actually allowed. So if you encounter a culture that doesn't understand argumentation, you can't prove that they understand property. Okay, because the only way to prove property as a universal value is if they are capable of argumentation. Now the thing that gets weird about this is there's not actually, well, technically speaking, I guess you could say there's some sort of IQ level where under this IQ people don't really understand arguments because IQ is actually moving. The average IQ always for any sample population is 100. That's just the way IQ works. But you, like, if people are getting smarter and smarter, the cutoff for where the level of intelligence required for argumentation keeps rising. Okay, and so this means that instead of just saying like you have to respect the property rights of people who are so stupid that they don't understand property rights, like that's not true. If they can't argue and if they can't make sensible arguments, the universal protections of the ethic of property do not apply. Okay, and so this is completely important. Okay, and again, in order for them to demonstrate ownership of their truth claim, they have to actually be able to defend it. Okay, and so if again, that's how you figure out whether or not this universal ethic of property applies to these people, is can they make arguments and can they defend these arguments. Now the other thing about violence that is just quite obvious, if you have conflict, some sort of property conflict, you solve this through violence. So the other times that conquest or defensive violence is allowed is when there's some sort of property conflict. So there's multiple times where you can have violence, but the one thing that's really important that you need to understand is that if people are too stupid, these property rules do not apply to them, so you can engage in wars of conquest. Okay, you absolutely can engage in wars of conquest. And the other thing to point out is that you might encounter some low IQ society where it almost seems like they're making arguments, but if they can't relinquish their truth claim, so I don't know, taken as an example, something like South Africa, where they just say things like kill all whites, whites are evil. If they can't relinquish this truth claim, no matter how much evidence is given to them, you can prove that they do not understand or they don't understand argumentation ethics, and therefore a war of conquest is actually completely justified, and it does not violate the universal ethic of property. Okay, so the final thing that I want to talk about is the reality of deception. Now, deception is interesting because someone can actually understand argumentation, but they can engage in deception. But deception is not a valid form of argumentation. If you allow people to deceive, now again, when you're deceiving, someone's putting forward a claim that they know is not true, but they're acting like they think it is true. Okay, the reason why this breaks down the concept of argumentation is because in order for argumentation to occur, you have to have two competing truth claims. Okay, so if they don't believe their argument to be valid, but they're making that argument anyways, they've withdrawn themselves from valid forms of argumentation, and so the rule is the exact same thing as it was for before when people don't understand argumentation. If you withdraw yourself from the realm of argumentation, you withdraw yourself from the the defensive protections that you get from argumentation. So when someone's deceiving, uh, they remove their own property rights by doing so. Okay, because they're dismantling this argumentation. Now again, this would only apply to the case where they've been deceptive, but the reason why this is important is because under the libertarian idea of property rights, deception's not really covered under this. But if you say that you can own things that are intangible and not just physical property, then deception is completely important, or it's absolutely important, because it breaks down argumentation as a whole, and it says that, okay, if you've withdrawn yourself from the realm of argumentation by using deception, then you've proven for this instance that the rules of argumentation, or the universal ethic of property that is derived from argumentation, does not apply to what you are doing, because you are breaking argumentation itself. Okay, so then the severity of punishment for deception is technically unlimited. Okay, and so this is a really big thing, because deception is a huge thing. Like if you're right now in our current society, if you're a liar, you can get away with basically anything. Now obviously they try to punish you more if you're a liar, but there's no real rule to how much they can punish you and why. But if you use the idea of argumentation ethics, by using deceptions, they've broken argumentation itself. And so this means that for whatever they're deceiving you over, there's technically no limits to the severity of punishment. Now this doesn't mean you shouldn't limit the severity of your punishment, because that's stupid and that'll cause more problems than you want. But you know, if you see something like where somebody murders someone and completely lies about it, your question is how brutal can your response be? Well, if they're using deception to lie about it, it can be as brutal as you want. Okay, and so the reason why this is important is criminals without arguments for their actions are fucked. And now this applies in two different ways. Again, a low IQ criminal, where in the current system they say, oh, if you're too stupid, then you can't be proven to be responsible for your actions, so they actually let you off more easy. But if you use argumentation ethics, there's no reason why you can't punish them to insane limits. But this is also very important for deceptive people, because obviously if you're intelligent enough to try and use deception well, you've just forfeited your the protections on you and your property. Okay, because deception is not a valid form of argumentation. Okay, and so this is very important, because it puts a massive incentive on people to tell the truth. And again, this is a huge thing within Propertarianism, is that truth telling is one of the most basic components of what makes Western civilization function. But again, if you use argumentation ethics and you say, okay, well, once you've engaged in deception, you've removed yourself from the realm of argumentation, and so for this instance, the universal ethic and the universal rules of property that would normally apply to you do not apply, which means that there's no limits to the violence that can be done with you. A criminal completely fucks himself, and it puts a massive incentive on them to be truthful. Okay, and so these are the points that I've been trying to get across. I know my first video I didn't really get them across that well. Again, I do enjoy when people critique this, but this is why I think Propertarians really need to start adopting this, because it's completely beneficial to them. And again, although there's no real reason to try and just completely, argue with everybody you see and trying to prove or try and get Propertarianism adopted by using argumentation ethics, it's always good to have an objective proof of your ethical system. And again, the only thing that Propertarianism is completely based on property, and the only thing you can prove as a universal ethic is the universal ethic of property. Okay, and it follows completely and 100% the definition that Kurt Doolittle gets or gives when he says property is that which you or that which people are willing to defend. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope this explained the concept a little bit better. And again, if you guys have critiques of it, let me know in the comments.